Okay, good morning, class. I have finished giving comments to all the rough drafts that were available to me in your response to literature folders. There are some mistakes that are showing up in multiple student papers, and so I want to address them so that you can put them into your final drafts if you choose, or later when we do response to literature paper number 2. And I do want to say that although I'll be using student examples right from the class, these are common mistakes, so I'm not just picking on these students. More than one person is doing all of these mistakes. First, what I want to do is I want to talk about these imagine leads that we're doing. These are great. They're great because they're better than just doing what's called a placeholder lead, where you would just talk about The History Teacher by Billy Collins' poem, and then you would go on and say that it cover something about the relationship between children and teachers. You guys are doing these creative leads. One of the problems that's starting to appear, though, is it's obvious that you have been given some tips as to how to do that, and you're following a format. So one way that you need to mature your writing is when you're doing one of these tips and tricks, you need to be purposeful. So Chris writes that imagine that the Ice Age was really just a period in which people wore sweaters. He's clearly indicating that he has read the poem, he remembers that moment, but then the next sentence he says, well, and the history teacher, and then he goes on. Which means that he hasn't been really thinking about how he wanted to use the imagine lead. If you want your reader to be imagining something, there needs to be a purpose to imagining that. Do you want them to be worried about the world that they see? Do you want them to change the world that they see? So you can use these creative leads, but now it's time to start thinking about which one works best for what I actually want to communicate in my paper. All right, and I think we should start taking up this well. A lot of people are answering their own question with well. It's just a little bit too informal. Okay, Chris's paper is also a good example of someone who used block quoting, and he did a good job. I just want to show some things about block quoting that we all can be aware of. You don't need a period at the end of it because the quoting of the text being offset is what does that for you. Same way in which there's no quotation marks. I took those out because that's not necessary either. It's actually offsetting the text that shows someone very clearly as I scroll by this that this is not Chris's words, this is Mr. Collins' words. All right? Everything else is done correctly. Moving on to Ian's. Ian here has some great context. He says, lastly, when the children go outside, Colin says, mussing up their hair and breaking their glasses. And so he wants to talk about that moment that we talked about in the poem where the children show some of their behaviors. But then he chooses to use words that a lot of people are doing where you directly reference the quote that you just used. Something like this quote shows, this shows, the author is writing this because, all that sort of qualifiers that are unnecessary because in your tone, because you guys are speaking with such good literary voice, it is clear that Ian wants to comment on this. Lastly, when the children go outside, here's a quote. And so he can just write his sentence here, these kids, because this pronoun here, these kids, covers these children. So I know as the reader, he's talking about this. All right. So if you find a this shows or this proves, see if you can just take it out, because it'll probably sound more authoritative if you start right at the beginning of what you wanted to declare. All right. And the last thing, I want to look at this should be Maples. All right. You guys are doing some really good stuff with that. You are connecting the literature to things that are going on in the world around you, which means that your papers have high relevancy. That's what you should be doing. So she talks about that the history teacher is completely oblivious to the fact that the children have already lost their purity. That's a good read of the poem. We all agree that that's kind of what the poem was about. So it's a good topic sentence, but it has a problem when it comes to literature analysis because she's not actually referencing how the poem works to show that. All right, because we actually want to talk about what Billy Collins is doing that makes him a good poet. Down here, in her commentary, she says, the mood painted here by the poet is warm and cheerful. That's what we're talking about. That warm and cheerful mood, is that what is showing that he's oblivious? Because while the children are punching each other and doing the stuff on the classroom. It's a nice sunny day and there's flowers. So she should change to say that he's completely oblivious to the fact that children have already lost their purity, and something along the lines of how we know he's oblivious because of the scene that has been set. And as soon as I use that word scene, if I use a word like characterization, juxtaposition, metaphor, simile, imagery, as soon as I use one of those literary words, then I know that the student is making a literature analysis as opposed to just a good comment. It's a good comment, it's just not connected to the poem. All right, good stuff, everyone. If you have any questions about these tips, please email.